"Everything is ready," I said into the phone. "Do it now." Then I hung up, walked back into the living room and sat down at the head of the Christmas table like nothing had happened. My daughter-in-law was still staring at me from across the room. Her arms were crossed, her jaw was tight, and there was a wine glass in her hand that she'd been gripping so hard I half expected it to shatter. My son was standing beside her, not looking at me. He hadn't looked at me in about 40 minutes. That was fine. He would look at me in about 40 minutes. That was fine. He would look at me soon enough. Let me go back to the beginning. My name is not important right now. What is important is that I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer with the city of Edmonton, and I own a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street in Sinclair, Albert, Alberta, that I paid off completely by the time I was 58. I am not a wealthy man by any grand measure, but I am comfortable. I worked for everything I have. My late wife and I both did. Her name was Irene. She passed from ovarian cancer 3 years ago this past October. Not a day goes by. My son, I will call him my son throughout this, because that is what he is, whatever he has done, is 31. He works in commercial real estate in Calgary. He married his wife Sylvia 4 years ago. They have no children. They have a condo in Beltline, a lease on an Audi, and what I would describe as an appetite for a lifestyle that consistently outpaces their income. I say that not as a criticism. I say it as a fact, because facts matter in what I am about to tell you. The first sign that something was wrong came 14 months before that Christmas dinner. I received a letter from my bank, a physical letter sent to my home, informing me that my home equity line of credit had been accessed and that the current outstanding balance was just over $42,000. I stood in my front hallway and read that letter 3 times. I do not have a home equity line of credit. I never applied for one. I never wanted one. I called the bank that same afternoon. The woman I spoke to was polite and thorough and increasingly alarmed as our conversation went on. The line of credit had been opened approximately 6 weeks earlier. The application had been submitted online. The name on the application was mine. The social insurance number was mine. The date of birth was mine. The answers to the security questions were all correct. Someone who knew a great deal about me had applied for this line of credit in my name. I asked the woman to freeze the account immediately. She did. She also flagged it for the fraud department and told me I would receive a call within 5 business days. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat down in my kitchen for a long time without moving. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. It was not panic. It was something quieter than that. It was the particular stillness that comes when something terrible presents itself, not as a surprise but as a confirmation of something you had been trying not to believe. Because I had been noticing things for a while. Small things, at first. A piece of mail I could not find. A phone call from my investment advisor that I had not initiated, asking me to confirm some changes to my account that I had not requested. An email from Service Canada about my pension that asked me to verify information I had never submitted. Each one, on its own, was easy to explain away. Together they formed a picture I did not want to look at. My son had visited me in St. Albert 6 weeks before that letter arrived. He came alone. Sylvia had stayed in Calgary. He said she wasn't feeling well. He stayed for a weekend. We went to Earl's for dinner on the Saturday night. We watched an Oilers game. On the Sunday morning, I left him alone in the house for about 90 minutes while I drove to my friend Leonard's place to help him with some drywall. 90 minutes. I went to the RCMP in St. Albert on a Tuesday morning. I filed a formal report. I brought the letter from the bank, the email from Service Canada, and the statement from my investment advisor. The officer who took my report was careful and kind and did not dismiss a single thing I told him. He said these cases were more common than people realized, and that they were often perpetrated by people close to the victim. He used the word victim. I remember that. Then he asked me if I had any idea who might have done this. I said I had a suspicion. He asked me to elaborate. I told him about the weekend visit, about the 90 minutes, about the documents I kept in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, birth certificate, sign card, pension statements, investment account summaries, all of which would have been accessible to anyone who knew where to look. My son had grown up in that house. He knew exactly where everything was. The officer wrote everything down. He told me that the investigation would take some time, and that in the meantime I should not confront anyone or change my behavior in any way that might alert the suspect. He said that if I could, I should try to document any future interactions. I asked him what he meant by document. He told me. I drove home and ordered a small digital voice recorder from Amazon. It arrived 2 days later. I also called my lawyer, a woman named Brenda, who I've trusted for 15 years, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting me once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Arthur, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." She told me that approximately 2 months earlier, someone had submitted a request to update the emergency contact and secondary executor on my will. The request had come in by email using an email address that was close to mine but not mine. One letter different, a lowercase l instead of a capital I, the kind of thing that is almost impossible to catch at a glance. Brenda's assistant had processed the update without flagging it because the request had included correctly formatted copies of my identification documents. The secondary executor on my will, the person who would have significant legal authority over my estate if my primary executor was unable to act, had been changed to Sylvia, my daughter-in-law. I sat in my car in my own driveway and looked at the garage door and thought about Irene. I thought about the 28 years she and I had spent building this life together. I thought about the morning she told me her diagnosis, how she had held my hand and said, "We're going to handle this with grace." I thought about how I had promised her, at her grave in Beechmount Cemetery on a cold, grey morning in October 3 years ago, that everything she worked for would be protected. I had made a promise to a woman who could no longer hold me to it. That was the moment I decided I was going to be very, very patient. I did not call my son. I did not confront Sylvia. I went home, I made a pot of coffee, and I called Leonard. Leonard is my oldest friend. We met on a job site in Fort McMurray in 1987, when we were both 26 and stupid, and thought we were going to be rich by 30. We were not rich by 30, but we were still friends at 64, which is better. Leonard is retired RCMP. He spent 22 years with the force, and he knows people. More to the point, he knows how these things work. He knows what evidence looks like and what it doesn't, and he knows the difference between what feels true and what can be proven. He listened to everything I told him. Then he said, "How long do you have before any of this becomes irreversible?" I said I wasn't sure. He said, "Then we need to move quickly, but we need to move carefully." Over the next 3 months, Leonard helped me build a file. The bank's fraud department confirmed that the IP address used to open the line of credit had been traced to an internet cafe in Calgary. The RCMP investigation found that several of my investment account changes had been submitted via a portal login that my son had used before. He had helped me set up the account 2 years earlier, and I had never changed the password. That was my mistake. I owned it. There was also the matter of the $42,000. $34,000 of it had been transferred in 2 installments to an account that investigators were eventually able to link to a numbered company registered in Alberta. The company had been incorporated 8 months earlier. The sole director was Sylvia, my daughter-in-law. The remaining $8,000 had been withdrawn in cash from an ATM near their condo in Calgary over 5 separate transactions. I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want to be honest about something. There were days during those 3 months when I almost picked up the phone, not to confront them, but just to hear my son's voice, just to find some small thing to hold on to that might make the picture I was looking at less clear than it was. I am his father. I changed his diapers. I drove him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning every Saturday for 6 years. I sat beside his hospital bed when he was 9 and had his appendix out, and I held his hand, and I told him I would not move until he was okay. I do not tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because I need you to understand that none of what came next was easy, even though it had to be done. In late November, my son called and invited me to Christmas dinner. They were driving up from Calgary, he said. Sylvia wanted to do something special, he said. He had the warmth in his voice that he used to have when he was a teenager, and he wanted something from me. I had learned to recognize it over the years. He had always been charming when it suited him. His mother used to say he could talk the frost off a window. I said, I would love that. I said it would be wonderful to see them both. After I hung up, I called Leonard, then I called Brenda, then I called the RCMP officer who had been handling my case, a corporal whose last name I will not share here, but who I will say was thorough and excellent at his job. We made a plan. I want to tell you about Christmas dinner. The turkey was mine. I made it the way Irene always made it. Brined overnight, stuffed with sage and thyme and half an onion, roasted low and slow. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones we only brought out for holidays. I put Irene's candle holders in the center, the brass ones her mother had given us as a wedding present. I poured myself a glass of Niagara Cabernet, and I stood in my kitchen and I breathed. They arrived at 4:30. Sylvia was carrying a bottle of Prosecco and wearing a smile that did not reach her eyes. My son hugged me at the door. He smelled like the same cologne he'd been wearing since he was 22, and it nearly undid me, standing there in my own doorway holding him. I let go first. Dinner was pleasant, the way a calm sea is pleasant when you know what's beneath it. We talked about the drive up from Calgary, about the traffic on the QEI, about whether the Oilers had any realistic chance of making a deep playoff run. We talked about everything except the things that mattered. It was halfway through dessert, my wife's butter tart recipe, which I make every Christmas, which my son has loved since he was small, when Sylvia set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of someone who has decided the time has come. Arthur, she said, we actually wanted to talk to you about something. I set down my own fork. She said she and my son had been thinking, and that given their financial situation right now, she used that phrase, their financial situation, as though it were a weather system, something that had simply arrived. They felt it would make the most sense for them to move in here, into my house, just temporarily, she said, just while they got back on their feet. She said the mortgage payments on the St. Albert property would be much more manageable if they were splitting them 3 ways. I looked at her. Then I looked at my son. He was looking at the butter tarts. I said calmly, I don't have a mortgage. The house is paid off. She blinked. She had not expected that. Then she adjusted and said that, regardless, they could contribute to utilities, maintenance, property tax. She said it would be good for me not to be alone. She said, and I want you to pay attention to this particular sentence. She said that it might be a good idea for someone to be around, given my age, to help manage things. I was very still. My son finally looked up from the table. He said, Dad, we're not trying to overstep. We just think it makes sense. I asked him if Sylvia's parents were also planning to join us. He said, no, of course not. Why would he say that? I said because the numbered company she had incorporated in February had a mailing address that matched an address in Red Deer that I believed was associated with her family. The room went very quiet. Sylvia's face did something complicated. My son pushed back from the table slightly, the way people do when they want to create distance without technically leaving. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I set on the table a printed summary, 2 pages, prepared by Brenda, outlining the fraudulent credit application, the unauthorized changes to my investment accounts, the $34,000 transfer to Sylvia's numbered company, and the forged executor update to my will. Sylvia said I didn't know what I was talking about. I said I had spoken to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit, and that they had been building a case for the past 3 months, and that the investigation was now at a stage where charges were being finalized. My son said, Dad, just listen for a second. I looked at him. I said, I've been listening. For 14 months I've been listening, and watching, and documenting. I stood up from the table and walked to the front window. Outside, on the street, there were 2 RCMP cruisers parked at the curb, not with their lights on. Just there. Waiting. The way patience waits. I turned back to my son and my daughter-in-law. I said, "Leonard has been outside since 3 o'clock. He spoke to the officers this afternoon. Everything in that document has been shared with them. The warrant was signed this morning." Sylvia stood up. She said something that I won't repeat here. She said I was destroying the family. She said Irene would be ashamed of me. I held very still when she said that. I want to be honest. That one landed. That one took a second. But then I thought about Irene at the kitchen table, going through our investment statements on a Sunday morning with a cup of tea, making sure everything was in order, the way she always did. I thought about her saying, "We've worked too hard for this, Arthur. Don't ever let anyone take it without a fight." She was talking about cancer at the time. But she would have meant this too. I said, "You should both sit down. The officers will knock in a few minutes. It will go easier if you're calm." My son looked at me. His face had the expression of someone who has just understood, fully and finally, the distance between what they thought was possible and what actually is. He said, "Dad, I'm your son." I said, "I know. That's the part that will take me a long time to get over." The knock came at 7:14 in the evening. I opened the door. Corporal Hebert and his partner came inside. They were professional. They were thorough. Sylvia did not go quietly. My son went quietly. He looked at me once, at the door, before they walked him out to the cruiser. I don't know what I looked like to him in that moment. I hope I looked like someone who had loved him. Because I had. I closed the front door. The house was very quiet. The brass candle holders were still on the table. The butter tarts were mostly untouched. I sat down in my chair. Irene's chair is still to the left of mine. I've never moved it. And I poured the last of the Niagara Cabernet, and I sat there for a long time. 3 days later, Brenda confirmed that the unauthorized changes to my will had been fully reversed. The bank's fraud unit resolved the credit file, and my credit score, which had taken a hit, began to recover. The investigation expanded somewhat. The numbered company in Sylvia's name had connections to at least 2 other financial irregularities that I was not the only person affected by. Leonard came over on Boxing Day and I made a pot of venison chili, and we watched the World Juniors and didn't talk much about any of it. That felt right. My son is currently working with a lawyer. I do not know what his future holds. I know what I hope for him, though I am not ready to say it out loud yet. I know that hope and accountability are not opposites, even when it feels like they should be. I still make the butter tarts at Christmas. I made them this year, same recipe, same pan Irene always used. I made 12, I ate 2. I put the rest in a tin and left them on Leonard's porch on my way to the cemetery on Christmas morning. Irene always said there is no point in making butter tarts for one person, because you will either eat too many or waste them, and both outcomes are sad. She was right about most things. I stood at her grave for a while. The snow was dry and fine, the kind that squeaks under your boots. I told her everything was taken care of. I told her the house was safe. I told her the house was safe. I told her I was okay, which was true enough for a cold Tuesday morning in December. Then I drove home, unlocked the front door, and went inside. The butter tarts are still in the tin on my counter as I write this. There are 4 left. I keep meaning to finish them. I've had a lot of time to think these past few weeks about how things unfold. Not in any grand cosmic sense. I'm not a man who leans on that kind of framework, but in the plain, observable sense that what you do tends to come back around eventually. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but it comes. Sylvia and my son didn't wake up one morning and decide to become the people they became on Christmas Day. It happened gradually, the way most things do. Small choices, each one easier than the last because the previous one had gone unpunished. A password left unchanged, a filing cabinet left unlocked. A father who trusted because that is what fathers do. Every step along the way, there was a moment where a different choice was available. They didn't take it. That's not fate. That's just the accumulation of who you decide to be, repeated over and over until the pattern is impossible to deny. What I keep coming back to is this: I almost let it go. Not because I didn't know what was happening, but because knowing is painful when the person doing it is someone you love. There is a particular kind of cowardice that disguises itself as kindness. The willingness to look away from something wrong because confronting it will cost you something. I was tempted by it. I want to be honest about that. There were nights when doing nothing felt like the gentler option. But doing nothing would not have been gentle. It would have been a slow failure of everything I owed to Irene, to myself, and though it is hard to say, to my son as well, because allowing someone to continue down a path like that, without consequence, without a wall to run into, is not love. It's just a longer way of letting them go. What protected me in the end was not luck. It was that I had spent 64 years trying to be a man who kept his word, paid his debts, and told the truth, even when a comfortable lie was available. That kind of living is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself, but it builds something. A way of seeing clearly, a network of people who trust you, a set of instincts you can rely on when things get difficult. Leonard came when I called because 37 years of friendship had earned that. Brenda acted quickly because 15 years of honest dealing had earned that. The corporal took my report seriously because I came in with facts, not emotion, and I had documentation because I had learned, somewhere along the way, that the truth needs to be legible to be useful. I think about what I would tell a younger man facing something similar. I would tell him that patience is not the same as passivity, that gathering evidence is not the same as doing nothing, that there's a kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't make threats, doesn't need to be the loudest person in the room. It just keeps working, quietly, until the work is done. I would also tell him that the grief doesn't go away just because the situation resolves. I handled what needed to be handled. The house is safe. The will is restored. The file is with the Crown. And I still miss my son the way he was when he was 9 years old and I was holding his hand in a hospital bed. Those two things exist at the same time. I've stopped trying to make them not. Irene used to say that a person's character is just their choices, made consistent. I think she was right. I think that's true of my son and Sylvia, and I think it was true of me, standing at that window on Christmas evening, watching the cruisers at the curb, feeling something I can only describe as a very tired kind of peace. The house is quiet now. The brass candle holders are back in the cabinet. I'll get them out again next year.